as to sort of how you can move your careers forward as efficiently and effectively as you possibly can. So with that, turn over to John. Thank you.
We're actually not exactly in the placement business. We do the same thing that Booz Allen or Arthur D. Little does with organizations. We're consultants to organizations. Organizations have a problem, we come in and we help them define what the problem is, and generally the solution is a person. And then they hire us to go out and find that person. And as Fred said, we've done this all over the world and continue to do that. Probably operated in 15 or 20 countries. Started this business in 1975 when I was probably not much older than you guys. So I was 26 years old. Didn't know any better. We were the first firm incorporated into the executive search business in the state of Florida. However, there wasn't any business in Florida, so the internet had not yet been invented, so we took a book called Standard & Poor's, and we figured out who would want to hire us, or who we hoped would hire us, and jumped on an airplane and went out and found some business in places like Minneapolis and New York and Chicago, companies like Digital Equipment in Boston and Medtronic in Minneapolis and Burroughs in Ohio. So, along with that, I had a neighbor who was had just moved here from California, and we got to be friends. In fact, boat partners. And he asked me. He was in the real estate business, and he asked me what I knew about real estate. And I said, well, I'm a history major, and I was economic history major, Renaissance and Reformation, specialty at the University of Florida. And I went back to the University of Miami and got an MBA later just to learn some new buzzwords, but I knew nothing about the real estate business. Didn't even know it was a business. So he said, if you're willing to learn the business, we'll teach you, but we're underserved by your industry. So he was the head of administration for Arvida and went on to become the president of Arvida, and we had a 35-year run with Arvida and all their senior management. Along with that, they said it encouraged me to join the Urban Land Institute to really learn the business and understand it. So we joined the Urban Land Institute in 1981, and I've been a member ever since. Not missed a meeting, either spring or fall, and I've been on the Recreational Development Council. I've headed the Recreational Development Council, and then I headed a group that was responsible for all the recreational councils and had done a myriad of things with the ULI. But mainly there to learn the industry, to learn the eccentricities of the business. Our specialty, although we've done work in every facet of the business you can imagine, from warehouses to shopping centers to large-scale residential, commercial. We've found people who run office development in Germany, and shopping center development in Barcelona, and office development in Beijing. So our specialty really is, and what we have the biggest practice in the world in, is recreational development. That's real estate with amenities, so that they develop. The amenities could be a hotel, it could be a mountain, it could be an ocean, a golf course. Usually they involve most of those things. It's places where people want to go and own a first, second, or third home. And it's a business predominantly run by single entity companies. There's a few companies that are big, like Discovery Land, that have a number of different entities, but most of the companies are single entity, and they're a lot of fun. They're entrepreneurs, people that sold their businesses, made a fortune, bought a piece of land, and thought, boy, this is an easy business, I'll do it. The one thing they didn't learn is that they are selling something in their projects that no one needs. They have to create a want, but no one needs. It's a big consumer product, and it's an emotional sale, and consequently, they learn some lessons. And experience is always the sum of your mistakes, and most of the people that get into the business have no tenure in the business, and they gain lots of experience. So that's where we've had probably the biggest part of the practice over the last 20 years. And it's a very similar business worldwide. In addition to doing executive search, we also do acquisitions and mergers. We put several deals together in St. Kitts and Reno and other places, and we also do advisory services. So we did one in St. Petersburg, Russia, and getting ready to do one in Rio de Janeiro in the next month or two, about a large land piece that they have designed for residential development. And you know, it's the same thing in finding someone to run a company. You find people that have an experience in that business. We're simply advisors, not planners, so we'll be advising them on highest and best use and proper development strategies on how to approach this. Again, trends are things that you need to stay ahead of and need to stay current with. The business changes, it's dynamic, it never stays the same. And if you're ahead of the curve and understand what those changes are and can work into those changes, you're much better off. The real estate business has undergone, as many of you know this already, a number of substantial changes over the last 7 or 8 years. We've been through probably the worst recession. We've been through 5 recessions. I started in the business in '75, and that was the '74-'75 recession. You probably don't remember that, but the Saudis turned off the oil, and there were long lines of the gas pump, and we decided we were never going to have that problem again, which we never completely solved. But that there was also a number of REITs that were formed to fund real estate developments that all folded, and it was a huge mess that was going to take 10 years to work our way out of, and it took about 2 before the business started cranking again. In the 1980-81 recession, where interest rates went up to 19 and 20%. Imagine doing a project when you had 20% interest rates. And people felt they were very fortunate to get home loans at 14%, 30-year loans. Imagine that. There were people in the 80s that said we'll never see single-digit rates again in our lifetime. You know, this is something that economics is not an exact science. The 1986-87 Tax Simplification Act, which added probably 20 or 30,000 pages to the IRS tax code, also had a huge impact because it allowed no direct write-offs of investment property, of which that's the predominant way that doctors, lawyers, and all kinds of different people got into the real estate business. It caused a collapse in that business, and that was followed shortly thereafter in 1990 and 91 with a huge economic collapse. And of course the S&Ls went pretty much down as an industry in banks throughout the United States, and we approached the business a little differently during that time. The RTC, Resolution Trust Corporation, was founded to take literally $1 trillion worth of real estate, roll it up into probably 6 big bundles and sell it. But the interesting thing about that recession is by 1993 we were out of it, and the business, we had a 15-year run in the business. You know, we had small interruptions, the tech crash in the late 90s and the 9/11 impacted the business, but short term. We had a pretty good run up until 2005. The summer of 2005 is probably the apogee of the real estate market. It declined after 2005, although there was so much pre-sold that the pipeline was so full, no one really felt the effects until really 2008. That was significant in the fact that Bear Stearns went down, and followed later by Lehman, which was a shock to the system, and you know what's happened since. While we've rebounded in real estate, you know, the conundrum today is that we've had a declining median income in the United States of about $5,000 or $6,000 over the last 5 years. And we've had the middle class that's disappearing at a rapid rate. They talk about the 1% has gotten richer, and indeed it has, but it's not 1%, it's 1/10 of 1%. 0.9% has stayed flat, or slightly gone down or slightly up, depending on what the survey is. 1/10 of 1% has been a straight line curve up. There's a huge disparity in the community today, and what that portends, I don't know, but the backbone of the United States has always been the middle class. I mean, they are, with a strong middle class, you know, the rest of it goes. With a weaker middle class, these things, the business has gotten significantly better. Rates are better. There's some certain aspects of the business that are very strong right now, like multifamily across the country. But things just to be aware of. There, as I said, the business is dynamic. It changes all the time, which is the interesting part of the business, and I think the most fascinating. As I said, the business has gotten better. It's probably not good to question why, but it has, and maybe because we've been in a 7-year slump. The economy looks like it's getting better, but you know, the major concerns, I believe, are getting the middle class back on their feet, and that's jobs, full-time jobs, with real income wages and growth in income. But the real estate business will remain strong, I think, for the next, who knows. The one thing you can count on, we will have another recession. No one knows when, but it will happen. And you'll probably go through multiple recessions, you know, through your career. And it's how you manage through the recessions. Is if anybody can manage through good times. It's not hard. You know, when you can pitch a tent and sell it to an investor, it's very easy. But the difficulty of real estate, and the one that separates the professionals from the non-professionals, is how you manage through a recession. And if you don't plan for a recession, you're probably out of business by the time one hits. So it's always prudent to plan on cycles, because they're going to happen. And it doesn't mean you stop. It doesn't mean you be less of an entrepreneur. You stop looking forward, but you always have to ask. We did a consulting assignment one time in Mexico. For the largest recreational developer in the world, Grupo CDEC, and spent the whole summer talking to their division presidents. They employed 5,000 people across Mexico, built much of what we see in Cancun and on both coasts of Mexico, and in Guadalajara in Mexico City. I asked each of the division presidents, what's the worst thing that could happen? What is the thing that you fear the most? What keeps you awake at night? And to a person, they all said the devaluation of the peso. I mean, that is the killer. And so I got them to think about planning for the devaluation of the peso, not knowing that it would happen, but just plan for it. So if you plan for it, then when it happens, if it happens, you know what to do with it. And I also got them to agree that what they probably ought to do is decentralize the company. You know, get into their core businesses. They're in the hotel business. They had a number of hotels and a hotel management company. Separate them out. They had planning firms. They had architecture firms. They had construction firms. Take those divisions, spin them out, and you know, organize them separately. Get down to your core business being development, and that would be a handful of people, probably 100 or so. Yeah.
When you recommend something like that, it doesn't necessarily take it away from the business. It's still a part of the business, though, right?
Sure.
It's just like under its own name.
Under its own name, you spin it out, you hire it back. So if it's a planning firm, you hire it back to do your planning because they know your company. But the one thing that you can do in the middle of a recession is you don't have to hire a planning firm. You don't have to carry the overhead of an engineering firm or an architectural firm or a golf design business they even had, and a golf construction business. They all agreed to that, actually. We had a big meeting in Correas, and the CEO of the company that hired us to do this decided incidentally, the services firms were very much against this. They did not like this idea at all. The operating companies thought it was a great idea. The services company this wasn't what they wanted to do. The CEO decided not to do that. He said, I've heard your concerns. He said, but we're doing well, we're just not going to do that. And so we all went away, and 6 months later the peso went from 3 to 1 to 6.5 to 1. The company's borrowing was all in euro dollars, so it doubled overnight. They couldn't make their payments and they went bankrupt. Now, I'm not saying this would have saved them, but what it had done, they had a hotel operating company they could have sold. Somebody would have bought it. They had a hotel ownership company, a huge asset that gets easily sold. They had commercial properties. They had individual properties they could have sold it. So it probably could have sustained themselves through this recession with a good plan, but since they hadn't planned for it, it happened, and they went out of business. They no longer exist. I just use that as an example. You have to plan for adversity. It's going to happen. When times are going good, don't get overconfident. That can't tell you the number of people that thought they were great developers in 2004 and 5. Most of those people don't exist today. The ones that went through the 90 and 91 recession, that lost their properties, that learned, the old prayer was, please Lord, one more boom and I promise I won't piss it away. They remembered that. And now no one could have planned for this recession. No one could have foreseen what was going to happen. I mean, that's the uncertainty. You don't know. But plan for a disruption and you're much better off. Now, what I'd rather do is kind of turn it around and open it up for, questions. I have a, yes.
Sorry. Knowing that real estate technically is a long-term investment, so to speak, should those little valleys that happen really affect your investment that much?
It all depends on your financing. If you look at large-scale communities, the biggest problem they have historically is they got to put a huge amount of money into their infrastructure before they can start selling homes. And they might have to put in a golf course, a clubhouse. They have to develop a roads, water, sewer, get the infrastructure to the property, and pay all the necessary impact fees. So they might have, in one project we worked on, they had $170 million of infrastructure cost before they sold the first home. The recession hit. So how do you fund that? Especially with this short-term money. So it depends on your financial structure. And there's no element of the business that isn't equally as important. And the financial structure is as equally as important as to how you phase in development, how you leverage or lay off the risk. And so you get to manageable risk, not where you take all the risk because you get all the reward. You also get to have, when you take out a loan, the banks expect you to pay it back. If not, they may take the property from you. Yes?
Going to your career as an expert in recruitment, when you look into a company and assess that there's a bottleneck in finance or in capital raising or in the development side, what do you look in the individual that you're hiring? What are those things that you look more than the resume?
Well, let's take the two ways to answer that question. First of all, you look at the company. Most companies are deal people. They know deals. They know how to go out, find a good piece of land. They know how to get it financed. They know how to get it designed. They're not good organizational people. They know very little about organization, and most of them really don't care too much about their organization. I don't say that in general, and some very good professionals, but organizational development is something that is severely lacking in the real estate business, which is great. It's wonderful opportunities. So first of all, you have to identify what the issue is within the company. For instance, someone may call us in, we need a new vice president of sales. We're not selling anything. Well, that ain't their problem. I mean, their problem is, I went through a project in the south of Atlanta, and it was owned by a coal miner, and he had bought this 2,000-acre project. It's right next to Reynolds Plantation that was selling 500 or 600 units a year, and he wasn't selling but, you know, maybe a dozen. And he said he needed a new sales manager because he wasn't selling anything. And I went through the project with him. He had brand new roads that had cracks all the way through in patches, so it looked like they were old beat up roads. And he had about 7 or 8 villages, and each one had a crane in it. And I went and looked at the property, and you know, it just, if you walked into the property, there was no wow factor. And we went back to the clubhouse, and he says, "So what do you think? Can you find us a sales manager?" And I told him, "I don't think that's what you need." And he said, "Well, what do you think I need?" I said, "I think you need somebody that knows what they're doing. And you're a coal miner, and you know, this is a very difficult business that you're in." And that's not always the most wonderful thing to say to somebody, because he said that he went on to tell me how smart he was, and how much money he had made and so forth. And so I asked him, I said, "Could I go to West Virginia and buy myself, you know, a couple of mountaintops and get a bulldozer and a crane and be in the business just like you and make a ton of money?" He says, "We love people like you." I said, "Really?" He said, "Absolutely." He said, "You come and do it. You don't understand how difficult this business is. There's 37 levels of marketing in coal, and you got to do this and you got to do that." He said, "You come in, you think it's an easy business, you do all your stuff." He says, "I buy you at 20 cents on the dollar. That's how I make my money." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, why do you think the real estate business is any different?" And he later went bankrupt and sold it for 20 cents on the dollar in his property. So again, you have to identify what the problem is in order to sell it. Now, for people, everybody has their own way of doing things. And I like to find, it's not so much to find the experience, which is very important. It's somebody who's already done whatever we're hired to go out and find to solve this problem, but they also have to have a fit from a culture standpoint, to be able to fit that organization. It's a highly conservative organization, and you have somebody that likes to play at the edges, which is fine for most organizations. That probably personality wouldn't fit. The person wouldn't enjoy what he or she does in that organization. That organization would look at this person as a bit of an alien. So it's important to get a cultural fit, a personality fit, somebody that can solve the problem, and that fit is equally as important as the background and experience that we look for. And so, but unlike a piece of property, when you go out to hire people, you might think in an economy like this, in a business like this, it would be easy to hire people. But the opposite is there. People, if they're nervous about the future, they're hesitant to make a change. I have a client that's a Greek developer that's developing in the Caribbean. They're also developing in Greece and Cyprus and Mediterranean, and also we worked on a project with them in the DR in Panama. And we're dealing with people that are predominantly, for Panama and the DR, that are native Spanish-speaking people. They're Greek. And so they've never really worked with someone like us before. They thought they had. And so their first 2 offers, well, we got paid anyhow because we're paid as a consultant. We don't get anything on the tail end. And but they would go around me and make offers. They did one to a person to run a project in the DR and also in Panama. In both cases, both those offers were turned down. And so finally I went and sat down with them and I said, "Look, you're paying for me this, you ought to use me and make your offers through me and we'll get these things done." Because both those offers should have been accepted, and they would have been had they done that. And I said, "You got to remember, you're making an offer and negotiating this deal in English. You're Greek. It's not your native language. They're negotiating with you in English, not their native language, their native Spanish. And I said, so you got a Greek and a Spaniard negotiating a deal in English, and I said, that's just a recipe for disaster, so, you know. And finally, we ended up putting someone in to run their project in Panama. It's an island off of Panama. They came from Brazil, and they listened to me. So they finally, you know, so sometimes it's difficult, but it is that's the fun part of the business that I'm in. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Absolutely.
But again,
That's an interesting, actually, case, because that's a company that was public in London, that we're doing a project in Panama, we're hiring the wrong person. They did not so oversee the recession, and they were in deep trouble when trying to reorganize the Pearl Island, and trying to hire the correct people. I remember that they've been struggling for years.
well, they've solved that problem now.
Yes.
Actually, the person they hired is terrific. He starts next week. Good guys. But they're investment bankers. And they know all the answers. They just haven't gotten the questions yet. And, you know, and interesting, the industry, hedge funds, they run the industry, or they did. And they put boards together of 30 and 35-year-old, you know, professionals that can run a good spreadsheet, but know nothing about the business. But they act like they know the business. They know the answers. And once again, I think they're going to gain some experience. They're going to make a lot of mistakes. You see it all the time. They're not long-term players in the business. You talked about sustainability. I mean, you have to look at projects in sustainability, and sustainability is, you know, going back to how it's financially structured. Hedge funds are not long-term players, they're short-term players. It's important, and if it's a large-scale, heavy infrastructure project, you align yourself with somebody that is a long-term player, not a short-term, because, you know, that time comes fast. When you have to repay the loan, that bullet hits, and the financing environment may not be very good at that particular moment. And if it isn't, you have a big problem that generally results in restructuring. So it's you know, it's a alignment of financial services, planning firms, engineering firms, others, you know, that are aligned with what your interests are and what you're trying to do is very, I think, very important to the process.
So how important is like personality testing and matching people's backgrounds to ultimately the positions that they would be best suited for? I mean, do you get into very much of that at all, or not?
Not the testing. I get to know the whole person. You know, I ask, since I am not the hiring source, I am strictly an advisor, I can ask whatever questions I want because I don't work for the company. So I learn the whole person. I want to know what they did in high school. I want to know how they got to college and why they chose the college, and what they did of note while they were in high school or college, and what they've done since. How did they get to where they are, and what have they learned along the way, which is a little bit different than experience because it tells me something about the person and the whole person. You know, an interior designer can come into a room, an empty room, and they can see that room fully furnished. When I come into an empty room, I see an empty room. And I can tell you what I like, but I don't have any clue as to how to furnish or design something like that. But when we talk about a person in an organization, I can see that person, not physically, but I can see that person. I know what that person looks like. I know the personality of that person. And I know what to look for. And so I try to match that up in the interviewing process. And yes, so alignment of background, once again, if you haven't done it before, you're gonna gain some experience, which means you're gonna make some mistakes. You learn from your mistakes. If you do something right, you don't learn from it. You do something wrong and it's impactful. It's indelibly imprinted on your brain, and hopefully you don't make the same mistake twice. And so it's the sum of those experiences that I think make up who you are and what you are, and how successful you are in the business. Again, managing through adversity. If you lost everything in a recession, you know, the next time the boom hits, you say, well, I'm not gonna do that again. You know, I'm now gonna figure out, if a recession or a cycle hits, how I can manage through that cycle. So maybe I'm not gonna look for 100% ownership. Maybe I'm gonna bring in partners. Maybe I'm gonna share the risk. Or maybe I'm not gonna personally guarantee, which is pretty much where everybody is today, unless they're inordinately desperate. But the background and alignment and experience is very important. If somebody's built office buildings and industrial buildings and shopping centers, but they've never done residential, it's a huge learning curve, and it's a different business. It's apples and oranges. Doesn't mean they can't do it, but it just means that they're gonna learn. Early on in the career, you can make those moves. We put the Disney development team together, the original team, to develop the Disney assets in Orlando, throughout the Disney system. And the first person we hired was an industrial development manager from Heinz in Boston, named Todd Mansfield. He went on to become the president of Disney Development. He now runs Crescent Resources. But he was a young Harvard MBA. He had about 5 or 6 years of experience in development, and Heinz hires exceptionally sharp people. And he came in and, learned a lot. So early in the career, it's probably not as important as it is if you're going to take over a division or a huge functional area. You want to have some. I'm getting hired to find the best in the business with that kind of experience that we can bring to the table. Like in the project we talked about in Panama, we needed somebody that built a 5-star hotel, somebody that understood. It's different when you're dealing with a brand and trying to bring a 5-star. The brands can drive you nuts, and they can drive the cost. It's very important to be able to understand how to. This person is actually not going to build it. He's going to oversee the general contractor. But being able to keep a project on time, especially in an island 40 miles off the coast of Panama, where you got to bring all your materials in by barge, and you have a 14-foot tidal fall, it's a very difficult task. And keeping it on time, on budget, within the bounds, and working with the brand to ensure that you can deliver the kind of project. I mean, brands are notorious about coming in and hiring their own interior designer and, adding significant cost to the project. Because the brands aren't the owners. The brands, simply get an operating fee and a piece of the gross, and you get to have the luxury of having their name on your project. So we had to have somebody that had that experience, that also could fit into a very unusual environment, difficult environment. It's much easier to build a project here in Fort Lauderdale or Miami than it is on an island 40 nautical miles away from land, where you have to bring all your materials. If you forget to bring the hammer, you got a long way to go back to get it. So it's in other things, we did some work in St. Petersburg, Russia, which was tons of fun, because it's fun dealing in other cultures. The Russians, up until Perestroika in 1992, had never had a private industry. They never built anything. Everything was owned by the government. In fact, the guys that are the billionaires today, they used to hire people to stand in line They may stand in line for 4 or 5 hours to go into a store to buy food. And you didn't get a selection of what food you wanted. You got whatever they were selling that day, and you got your allotment. In fact, one fellow I met right around Perestroika had somehow managed to get a flight to visit some relatives in Italy, in Venice. And he flew into Venice, and he was picked up by his relatives, and they stopped at a kiosk a gas station that had a little food kiosk, you know, in order to get some fuel. He went into the kiosk, he said it was more food than he'd ever seen in his lifetime in one place. And so you start with that experience of never built, never done anything, and you try to understand, you know, people in real estate development, what are their needs, what are their wants, what is their experience, how would they look at this kind of thing when they've never done it before and hadn't done it for 100 years. You know, from 1916 on, there was no private development in Russia. Everything was owned by the state, and the most god-awful things, and it was on, you know, St. Petersburg is under a National Heritage Trust, International Heritage Trust, so the preservation of buildings is a magnificent city. But it was a fun project to work with, so every culture has its things to learn from that, you know, make it interesting. Yes?
Earlier, you had mentioned something along the lines of you have to develop a want for a commodity that nobody needs.
This
Can
is
you elaborate
this is in the
on that?
recreational development business.
Oh,
So
right.
this is for projects like Hualalai, and it's on Big Island of.
So you're talking about with recreational things, you have to develop that.
I
need.
call it recreational development. It's not a perfect name. It's a second home development. So you're selling a second, a third, a fourth home to people. It's not a primary home.
Okay.
If it's a primary home, you're going to buy a primary home from somebody. If you're going to purchase a home, it's whether it's this development, that development, or the other development. When you fly to Hawaii or Panama or somewhere and you think about purchasing a home, it's not your primary. It's, you know, it's a discretionary purchase. It's an emotional purchase. It's the most difficult purchase that someone that enters that business, and most people in that business, which is why I like it, have never been in the real estate business, which is wonderful. I mean, they're all entrepreneurs. He just did some work for Richard Branson's company. He's developing 2 islands in the BVI's, Mosquito and Necker, and I mean, those are fun projects. Endless thing. The nice thing about my business is they pay me to visit and to work on their project, and to go to their project. And most of their projects are places where people will pay millions of dollars to be able to get into and buy, you know, real estate there. So it's a, you know, it's a nasty business, but somebody has to do it. Yes?
I'm sure you're familiar with Bimini.
I am.
I've seen it like an example where you're saying, you know, the ups and downs, the developer that wanted to do something and then, you know, went out of his reach, and then got help here, got help there. I've seen like 3 companies come in and leave. How do you see like a project like that where you're a visionary, you know, up to a point, and then you start giving away what you've sold, you know, basically because you need the money, you need to move forward, or you need.
Well, again, it's planning for diversity. If you look to the Bahamas, and we've done a lot of work in the Bahamas over the years, you can count the number of successful projects on one hand and probably have a finger or 2 left. Now, I'm talking about large-scale projects, not small things. You know, large, where it requires a great deal of infrastructure. Very few successful projects in the Bahamas. And so, in order to be successful in any real estate, you have to understand what the environment's like. If you're developing in a place like Bimini, go out and find a project that's been successful, and if you don't find any, you say, okay, why? You know, where did they fail? What did they do wrong? If you can understand that, you can start to put together, it doesn't mean that you can't be successful, doesn't mean a visionary can't be successful, but you gotta know why others haven't been successful. And you can't say, well, they didn't know what they're doing, I do know what I'm doing, you know, because I'm smarter than they are. Well, that doesn't work very well. It may be transportation, it may be airlift, it may be, there's a number of different reasons. It may be political uncertainty with the, you know, with the government. And who is the market? We worked in the, I was working on a project or putting together a company in Orlando, in the timeshare company, a guy that, his company was bought that later became Marriott Timeshare, became one of the biggest operating businesses in Marriott. And he was starting a company called Hilton Grand Vacations that we helped put together. And there was a project that a friend of ours had. He had built a condominium on St. Lucia. And the hurricane had come by, I forget which one it was, and it really impacted it, and the developer just wanted to walk away from it. And one could have bought it at 30 or 40 cents on the dollar. And I said, God, this is perfect. And I said, why don't you guys go down and buy this? He looked at me and he said, no, he says, I'm not interested. And here's a guy that's never seen a deal that he doesn't like. And I said, well, why? He said, doesn't have the traffic. He said, if I can put a billboard up and divert the traffic, I can be successful. I can build a better mousetrap. And if I have to bring the market to my project, the cost of sales goes up exponentially, and I can't make money in that project, which is a good lesson in the business. So going back to who is the market that comes to Bimini or to any of the islands? If you have to bring that market there that doesn't exist, well, your cost of getting that market there is very, very high. And that will, again, push the cost of sales, to where there's, you would have to be enormously lucky to be successful, which is probably one of the reasons why most of the folks in the Bahamian development business have not been successful.
Yeah, they're getting reverse thinking that way. They bring the ships up every
They
day.
bought the ship and they're bringing the people, right? They're, but, you know, are they really successful? I think they're just trying to stay busy until they figure out what they're gonna do with the Herald building.
That's what I think that also.
So, it's, Bimini's a place where people used to go on weekend trips. I've been going over there since the, late '60s, early '70s, and, you stay the weekend and fish and you come back. It's not a place where you want to go buy a home, and I don't think there's been any successful residential development of any scale in Bimini ever.
No. But I've seen like Rockville resorts, they stay here like for 2 years or so, and they spend a ton of money on and then, we used to go there often, and I saw also how the developers started to sell pieces of the property and the part of to the new people coming in, and then they leave and then they stop again with the project and nothing to do.
Well, when, again, if you're looking at a new acquisition, you gotta look at what could go wrong, plan for that, and what do you need in order to enact your vision, and how can you deleverage to be able to do that. And so that may mean selling off some pieces where you retain some architecture control or some product control of, what they're going to do, so that it doesn't negatively impact what you're doing. Again, it's just deleveraging and figuring out how you can lay off some of the risk, going forward with with a large project. Yeah.
You said you're working on some projects on Necker Island and Mosquito Island. What exactly are you doing for them, for those projects?
I brought in the regional director to run the projects, both projects.
And you have to actually physically go to locations in order to do that?
Well, yeah. In this particular
Gotta
case,
see what it's like.
they needed someone to run. Necker was running pretty well. I don't know if many of you know, it's a resort development. They generally rent the island as an entity. It's not a very big island. On Mosquito Island, which is the one that Richard is building his house on, And he's got 9 lots. That's a community development. So they're building common area facilities for 9 homes, and that'll be the total community on a 125-acre island. Now, the lots are not for the faint of heart. They go for, I think, $25 million, and probably will have $80 to $120 million per home invested. You know, they will come with staff. They'll come with landscapers, they'll come with cooks, and you know, all kinds of people, and then they'll have common area amenities. So the interesting thing was, where do you go to find somebody that can do that? You know, was there? Well, there's actually examples of that being done in the Seychelles and you know, in the BVI's and other places. So we had to go find people that had done that before successfully. We found somebody in the Seychelles. We found somebody in South Africa, somebody in Antigua, and somebody in London. They ended up hiring the person from South Africa. He also owns camps in South Africa. He's got 2 game reserves in South Africa too, so it's a business that he likes as well. He's not having a good week though. What you heard about Virgin Galactic?
Yeah.
Yes.
What's your volume like in terms of accepting jobs? I mean, how many times are you contacted to, you know, go and consult or hire for people? I mean, how, are you turning down people? I mean, how do you make that decision if you have more than one?
You mean whether we accept a position?
Yeah.
If it's not realistic, if I don't think it's realistic, I won't do it.
So you'll do preliminary work before you go there, depending on.
Well, I'll find out something about the company. I'll go talk to the company. I'll look what their expectations are for the example I gave in the project south of Georgia. We obviously did not work on that business. You know, I've had others. I'm currently bringing in a regional head of regional partner for development for 2 partners individually. The last 2 jobs they came to me with, I turned them down. I said, it's just not in our wheelhouse. It's not something I want to do. I don't think I can serve you as well. I didn't say I didn't want to do it. And if you don't feel you can bring, if you can't do a good job, if your heart's not in it, I've learned over the business, it is far more negatively impactful to take on that position and to fail. For whatever the reason is, so I'd rather avoid that. It's pain avoidance to actually turn down jobs, even if you need them. But in the long run, in the services business, the one thing that generates business is your reputation. So that's the, you know, we don't do any advertising, we don't do any solicitation. 100% of our business is referred by people all over the world. We've had Japanese clients, Kajima in Japan refers to their partners in Singapore. And so if you're hired for a service, any service business, and whether it be architecture or engineering or finance, whatever, you're hired to do a job and hired to do it well. And if you do it successfully, they'll come back. It's like a corner gas station. If they take care of your car and they do an oil change and they see you got a bad belt in your car and they replace it and say, I just replaced it, I'm just going to charge you for the belt, but I didn't want you to drive around in an unsafe car. Would you ever think about taking your car anywhere else? And you'd bring all your friends there. So he would grow a business without any advertising. He wouldn't need the yellow pages, he wouldn't need the internet. He would have a business because he actually cared about the clients and did something for them that was unexpected and didn't charge them for it. So I think marketing is very simple sometimes. Sometimes we make it way too complex.
Knowing that recreation is one of the areas that get hit the most when recessions hit, how is recreational development impacted during these times?
It was impacted enormously. I mean, it ran into a brick wall and fell over. The fortunate thing for us during this time, and it was not fun to be in the service business for the principal practice in recreational development, because there's nobody in the United States that needed anything. with the exception of projects that were bought out of bankruptcy by someone who bought the project and then needed to put together a team to manage it. Those were the exceptions, and we did some of that work. But it was also in the 91, 92 recession, we did a significant amount of work offshore. And so in this last recession, we did a significant amount of work offshore, because although this recession, the world was impacted. It wasn't just us, it was the world. I mean, Europe went down the same way, and they haven't recovered. There wasn't much going on. Actually, Russia was a fun place to be for a while. It's probably not a lot of fun right now. Their currency has devalued significantly. It was 28 to the dollar, is now 43. And yeah, it was a very difficult business. It's a discretionary buy. But the interesting thing was not affordability, because the people who could afford to buy a multi-million-dollar home in a wonderful destination, they still had money. But the biggest problem was they didn't want to buy something for $5 million that they could buy for $4 million the next year. The biggest concern and fear that they had was that they would make a bad purchase and that they would look like a fool. And when they felt the bottom had been reached and that the market was not going down any further, they started coming back into the business. So they've been back in the business, at least for the last couple of years, in the well-positioned projects, the ones that were well-designed, that were well-conceived, that were top-tier projects and top-tier locations, have managed pretty well through the recession. And they haven't, they've suffered, but not to the extent that the second and third-tier projects have. They really cratered. And some of them may never come back, at least in my lifetime. You had a question?
I saw on your bio up there that you did 2 buildings here in Fort Lauderdale.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you got those buildings? And
Yeah, I think.
They're historic, so you just rehab them, or?
Yeah, we did the first easement donation in South Florida. It was Southwest 2nd Street, New River Court. You know, I'm a history major, so I like history. I found this old dilapidated, historical areas within most cities are by nature very dilapidated and significantly in need of restructure. Historical development is a labor of love, not profit. So this was the center of Fort Lauderdale used to be on Southwest 2nd Street. The mayor lived upstairs in New River Court building, and the first drugstore was downstairs. And so it was built in wooden building, Dade County pine, built in 1929. And so bought the building for, it seemed like a pretty good price. I don't recall exactly, $700,000 or $800,000. But remember what I said, you gotta leverage your risk. I brought in 3 partners to do it. I brought in 2 from Arvida, one who's the head of commercial development, thinking, I've never done this before, so this guy can help me, and the other guy was the president, and I brought in another fellow. Ironically, they were so busy they didn't have time for this, so I had to figure it out myself. So I went and got it registered, got it approved by the Interior Department for to put it on the National Register, which was a criteria needed in order to donate the easement. If you donated the easement, but basically it is, you cannot change, we're in a historic district, you couldn't bulldoze it anyhow, but you can't change that building forever when you donate the easement. It has to look like it did, and like it does today. And so I thought that was easy, except for the fact you had to find somebody that could take that donation. There wasn't anybody in South Florida because nobody had donated a property before. Well, there was a company a group that was just formed called Dade Heritage Trust. And Don Slesnick was the president of it. He later became the mayor of Coral Gables. And they had formed that entity to take the donation of a building in Miami Beach. I had to do it in that fiscal year, you know, to help offset the, I mean, rats wouldn't live in this building when we bought it. The mayor's mother had been assaulted and robbed on the way to a restaurant there, which was on the New River. There's a chart house at the time. So it wasn't a particularly wonderful area. But they had just formed, and I said, well, how do you do an easement? How do you do the donation? What do you have to do for the presentation? He said, I'll send you a copy of what they're doing. So he sent me a copy, I copied it, and I submitted it, and we were the first to get approved by Dade Heritage Trust. I did it in 24 hours. And we were able to close, you know, on that easement donation, which was, you got to write off 25% of the entire cost of the project to investment tax credit, which, you know, allowed you to at least stay alive in the project. And we went on to develop it as, you know, small offices upstairs, because there used to be a little apartment upstairs, so we had 8 or 9 offices upstairs, and we had 3 commercial bays. And it was, again, it was a labor of love, because it was a very difficult. They were going to build a center for the performing arts. This was in '84 we did this. And they were going to build a Discovery Center, except they got delayed and they weren't done until the early 90s. And so for those years, 84 to the early 90s, it was difficult. But we came through, sold it in 2007 at a very nice price. And fortunately, you know, it was somebody that just had to have it. We were okay with, you know, party. And then in 1985, I did another building, which I still own. It's right next to the Water Garden. You pass it if you come into the downtown from the south over 3rd Avenue. It's a 4-story office building with a red stripe around it. It was a 2-story Art Deco building that had been just sort of bastardized and covered up, and they had a restaurant there called the Grapevine Pub, which we shut down. So I took it, I brought it back to what it originally looked like, beautiful building, and then added 2 floors on it, basically just to hold the land. And but my office is there, and I get to look at boats coming up and down the New River. It's the only office building on the New River, by the way, in the downtown area. And we did that with industrial revenue bonds. So we had brought in Jim Carver, who ran the Council of 100, which is the agency that administered revenue bonds. And so I asked him, once again, how do you do this? And so he sent me copies of people that had done industrial revenue bonds. And so I sort of pasted and copied and submitted a proposal. They accepted it. We got a bank to buy the bonds, and we were off developing the building into what it is today. And it's been probably one of the better investments that I've made over the years. You know, it's a great office location. We have a little suburban building in the heart of downtown Fort Lauderdale, right on the river. I live in Rio Vista, so it takes me, I can walk to work. I can take a boat to work, which was the intent. I come from a high-rise building where it took you 20 minutes to, you know, go around and park and find a parking place, and you can never remember where you parked. And so getting in and out of the building was just, you know, I wanted a building that you could walk up to, so we have ample parking. You can walk up to your office suite. We've withstood the recessions and stayed pretty much full the entire time since we've owned the building. And you know, eventually the rights on the building, since we're in the downtown rack, I can go 40 stories on that parcel at some point in time. But I'd have to give up my office, and that's the, you know, I don't want to do that right now. So those are the 2 buildings. We also invested in a 2,600-acre project in Reno, Nevada that I went in. One of my clients' son-in-law had this project. It's a phenomenal project. It's right off of Highway 80 overlooking the Sierras. And, you know, all the business in Reno was going to the master plan communities, and they're all wrapping up. And, you know, the market was strong, and he couldn't get any, he had it with Eastdil, and they couldn't get this project sold. So I said, well, you know, I can't do pretty pictures like Eastville, but I can bring the CEOs of all the major developers on the West Coast to the project and get their attention. Because I can just call them and say, go look at this project. And I ended up bringing in a group to develop the project, and they, as a part of that, they made me invest in the project, which I was happy to do because it was a great project. Although one of the lessons, I was a passive partner on that, I was not on the board. And they did something really stupid. They decided halfway into the project and the building of the infrastructure that they would have, they were gonna build a golf course. Stopped the project for 2 years, missed the market, and had the project about a third sold when the recession hit. And the recession creamed Reno, Nevada. And it's still a beautiful project. You know, the values have started to come back. If we get our capital calls back, it will be wonderful. You know, it's not been a good success. And but you know, that happens. It's real estate. It looked good. It should have been good. We would have had the project completely sold out by the recession if we hadn't stopped for 2 years to build a golf course. And golf courses are not great assets to own these days. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. We're looking into an island the size of Aruba right now. We're 3 companies. One is Chinese, another one is Spanish, and us in the financial side. One is development, the other one is infrastructure, and we're the finance. We're struggling in putting together if we should go as a consortium or each individual company should work into the island, or even to see if we're going to undertake the project and do the project. If you were called to submit a proposal,
Yeah.
what kind of services, what kind of things would you advise or can you do for a company that is looking to such a master plan and thinking, shall we put a combined team together or shall we all work separately?
Okay, I'll give you an example. I mentioned
You gotta pay for that. You gotta pay for that question.
Sounds like a free consultation, right?
we helped put this company called Hilton Grand Vacations together, and so we went to a charrette on how they were going to manage the company, because they had Hilton, which had their development team. We had another group out of the West Coast that had developed, and we had this fellow that was, he just left Marriott. You know, he made a ton of money through that. So we had 3 entities that we're going to develop this team. Now, how do we do it the right way? So we had a charrette with all these people, and one of the guys sitting at my table was a guy named Bob Taylor, who's from McKinsey. And we're all, what are the problems? Well, how are they going to, you know, from my perspective, how are they going to manage this entity? And at the time, their thought was, look, we're 3 people that like each other. You know, Hilton, they're going to do the development because we got Rob Barber, he's a development guy, and Al Tenbrook, he's the administrative guy, he's gonna manage the company, and me, a guy named Ed McClone, I'm gonna run the sales and marketing. So the 3 of us are gonna run the company. And so we were all in our little groups, and I said to Taylor, I said, Bob, you've been with McKinsey. I said, how many companies have you seen that have been successful run by 3 partners, equal? And that's how they're gonna manage it. He said, none. I said, this isn't going to work. It can't work, you know. And I said, you know, they need to have a single entity to run it. They need to have an organization to run it. They need to have a person to run it. It could be one of them. It could be whoever it is. It needs to be one person in charge. You will learn the best way to kill a good idea is to send it to a committee. You know, there has to be somebody in charge. There has to be somebody to make the hard decisions, the difficult decisions, the ones that have risk involved. And so at the end of the charrette, I had to get up and make the presentation because Bob said, I'm a partner, I can't get up and say that. So I got up and said that you guys got to have a single entity to run this. The 3 of you cannot run this, it won't work. And they, you know, they laughed and they looked at each other. No, we're good friends. We can make this work. We know what we're doing. We're all, you know, successful in the business. We know what we're doing. We're gonna make this work. So we're not gonna worry about it. Well, and 2 years later, I went in, 3 years maybe, and I had the task of firing all three partners. And they hired me to bring in a new president for the very simple reason I said it couldn't work. I mean, it's not rocket science. This is, you know, observing organizational structures. They gotta have somebody in charge. So there has to be an entity in charge. To answer your question, there has to be one entity that is not solely focused on finance or infrastructure or product. There has to be one entity that's focused on the whole project by itself. That's the advice that needs, I think, the best advice I can give to any project, especially when you're dealing with different cultures. Yeah.
You spoke about organizational development, and you know, some people that know how to put deals together. What are the key elements when looking at that you would include into that statement, organizational development? Or
Well, you know, I mean, that could take the next, you know, day or two. First of all, you got to know, why are you in business? One always got to ask, why are you doing what you're doing? What are you good at? And what is it that you're doing? You know, you need to have a big, you know, what is this going to look like that you're doing 5 and 10 years ago? You know, the vision. You got to have a vision of what you're going to do. You got to have values in the company. What values do you bring to the table? And then you got to have a mission. Now, you can't be all things to all people. You cannot be equally as good in every functional area of real estate. So when you pick an area, and then you have to organize around that. Now, it doesn't mean that you aren't in different areas, but for instance, if you're a residential developer, you're going to get into commercial development, and you try to understand it through, you know, through your residential experience, it's a mistake. So you might have to bring in somebody that's an expert, or you might have to venture or joint venture with a commercial developer that's had significant experience, the same level of experience you've had in residential. So it's important to align your mission, your goals with your organization. Certain things you can't outsource, certain things you need to outsource. And we've learned over the years that you really need your own planning division inside your own company. You know, and you know, that overhead is a killer. Same thing with a construction company. You might have a general contractor, but he oversees general contractors. In other words, you're still going to hire an outside. You want to carry carpenters and laborers and so forth, that organization. Well, you might save some money. You end up losing money in the long run because, you know, how do you fire or negotiate with your own staff, you know, in the building of a project. So you have to figure out what the business is, the core business, how you're going to make your money, and then organize around it. And what are the essential ingredients that you have to have in-house. If you're developing a residential or recreational project in a second home location, you have to, once you've done all the due diligence and the market research and all the things you need to do to develop a business plan, it's the execution. You have to have somebody that can execute in terms of doing the roads, water, sewer, and the infrastructure in. You have to have a very good financial manager, you know, to oversee that. Then you have to have a very good sales and marketing team. And you can outsource that, but then you lose control. You know, their livelihood doesn't depend on your success. If it's your own team, their livelihood depends on your success. So, you know, there's certain things that you don't want to outsource, that you want to have in-house. And so it all depends on what the organization is, what the mission is, what the goal is, and what the vision is of what you're trying to do. Always look at, first job I did in the executive search business in technology was with digital equipment. We went, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was huge. It was multi-billion dollars at the time. It was a $100 million company. And I went and visited with the head of engineering, and they were going to hire me to find someone that could develop this. It was a time when all the computer companies wanted to develop their own semiconductors. Hey, first problem I had was I had no idea what a semiconductor was. I was a history major. And, you know, again, the internet had not been invented, but, you know, fortunately it had Encyclopedia Britannica, which I copied, semiconductor, and I read on the plane up there so I could, you know, talk to the guy. And the first question I asked was not what the needs were. I mean, we talked about what the needs were. I mean, you know, I needed to be a PhD and needed to do this, this, and this. And I said, well, how big is this department? Well, there's only going to be one other engineer. I said, what's it going to look like 2 years from now? Well, it'll be probably 20 engineers. Well, would it be like 5 years from now? Well, it would be 40 or 50. And I said, well, you need to hire somebody that can manage 50 engineers, because you need to hire for the position of what you're ultimately going to be. And so we came back and, you know, did it, and that's what we brought in. We brought somebody in from Intel. And if you don't know where you're going, how do you know how to get there? And what are the tools you need to get there? So you have to know where you're going in order to, you know, make those decisions on how to get there. Yeah.
I just about forgot my question, but give me about 7 seconds, I'll come back to you.
All right.
So, one question, obviously, in terms of folks that are trying to prepare for a transition, maybe from another industry into real estate development from where they had been, kind of maybe breaking into the business, what sort of advice, you know, could you kind of offer up in that respect?
You know, that's a difficult question, because first of all, you're going to be competing against people, you know, at a management level that might have 5 or 10 years of experience in the business, in the real estate business, where you might have relative and good skills, but you haven't yet been in the business. So you have to figure out the entree into the business. Oftentimes, if you have an accounting background, a good way to get into the real estate business is through, you know, one of the accounting firms, the big firms. Or you might be in the brokerage side of the business that you can get in, and you can, if they don't care what your background is, if you've been successful in that business, you might be able to work your way into the company that way. It's very difficult to change industries. I find the opposite. When a recession hits, there isn't any business in real estate. You know, all these senior guys, 20, 15, 20, 30 years of experience in real estate say, you know, it's time to get out of this crazy business and get into something else. What do you think I can do? How are you going to compete with somebody that has 30 years of experience in consumer products or in electronics or in something else when you've been in real estate? You can't compete, not at the same level. So you have to figure out what you can contribute to the company and get there. If you're in the planning side of the architecture or the engineering side, get with a firm that is in that business, in the consulting side of the business, and you ease your way into development. The business is in its ascendancy right now. In other words, it is significantly better today than it was last year, which was significantly better than it was the year before. And not all parts of real estate have, you know, have grown at the same time. And certain areas, gateway cities, have done very well in North America. Vancouver, San Francisco, to some extent Los Angeles, obviously New York, Miami, and they will continue to do well. And there's also a trend that we're about 7 or 8 years into that will go for the next 50 years. There's a reurbanization taking place in the United States. People are moving from the country into the cities, from the burbs into the cities. It's a trend that you may not like, you may not want. It's happening. The prognostication is by 2050, 3 out of every 4 people in the world will live in a city. Right now it's 1 out of 4. So that is a transition that's happening. Well, I'd rather get in front of a tidal wave than you know, than chase something, you know, where it doesn't exist. We're talking about in the resort development business. One of the thoughts was, is greenfield development and resort development going to be much of a business in the next 10 years? Right now, well, you don't know, but right now, it's not a great business. Now, existing projects need to be finished up and built out, and they will be. Will there be as much of a demand? But where we've seen some success is why not bring the resort standards into urban resorts? Why not build urban resorts? Why not make nice places where people can have a second home and a primary home in the same location? And bring some of the elements of a resort into the urban project. In fact, on the project we're working on in Rio, that's what we're right at the very early stages, but I think that's what our recommendation is going to be, how we can take this project that's 35 kilometers north of Rio, that's surrounded by a population of 20 million people. So there's a definite market, but what would make that special? Well, let's develop an urban resort. Let's do something really neat. Let's take the elements, the successful elements of an urban resort and put it into there and make it, you know, the elements like safety that are very important, transportation that are very important, sustainability, all the things that, you know, that are important to every project. But let's make it fun to live there. Let's make it a safe environment where schools, shopping, and other things need to be taken into consideration. That, you know, it's and this is it's an 800 hectare project, so it's got plenty of room to do all this stuff in. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, my question is more on the entrepreneurial side. Because I know with the two projects you say you had in Fort Lauderdale, you brought in partners that could specialize and help you out with certain things.
Yeah, but I also told you that they didn't.
They didn't help
doing
you,
it
yeah.
myself.
In those cases when, all right, say I find a project that I'm really interested in, but I want to bring in partners, how do you go about that process? Is it a matter of you call up your friends and you present, you create a presentation for them and hope that they help you out? Or like, how does that work?
Well,
Bringing on partners.
friends and family are considered the safest form of investment initially in projects. But first of all, you got to figure out why you're interested in that project.
Mm-hmm.
And how it's going to make money and why you believe that and what's the research that is behind that in order to give you a sense that it's going to be a successful project. You know, once you have that, once you're determined, once you know that this thing is going to be successful if you develop it, then you have something that you can go out. And first of all, you don't have a project until you tie it up. And if you find a project and you're that interested, don't have the wherewithal to go buy it, well, go put it under option. You know, go put a refundable deposit down, and that refundable deposit is based on due diligence that you have to go out and do to ascertain whether you do it.
Isn't that usually not refundable? Like when you go try to do that?
That's called going hard, but
Oh,
no,
okay.
you can put an LOI and a refundable deposit on a project, which means you tie it up.
Mm-hmm.
When you tie something up, you have it under contract. In other words, you can execute on it. You have something. Until that point, you have a dream. You have nothing. And now when you have it, and it is under option, and usually they'll give you anywhere from, depending on the size of it, they'll give you anywhere from 30 to 120 days before your money goes hard. And when your money goes hard, then if you walk away, you lose it. But when it's refundable, you don't. It gives you the chance to go due diligence. You wouldn't put your money hard on something and go out and do your due diligence and then find out, you know, you've got environmental issues there and, you know, that would make the project unfeasible. You lose your money. So you would put your money down on a refundable deposit and then go out and do your due diligence. And then you can go and approach somebody, I've got this project, I got it under contract, this is what I need, this is how I'm gonna do it, and this is how we make money, and this is what our return is.
Okay.
And it's easier to do that when you have a product. If you don't, you just have an idea.
Okay.
And that's very hard to fund. Yep.
You mentioned sustainability as an element that you want to bring in, for instance, in the plus development. How do you see that perceived when you recommend, when you're called to advise, how important it is for you to bring it on the table because it's prestige or because it's required, or how do you deal with that big word, sustainability?
Well, sustainability means a lot of things to a lot of different people. It's the ability to from an ownership standpoint, is be able to own the company through its cycle and through its development cycle. And so it can be financial sustainability is the most important first off. Infrastructure, you don't want to build something that's going to become obsolete by the time you get done with it, or halfway through the project, you got to go rip it up and put something else in. So you have, there are an awful lot of elements of sustainability that need to be looked at. So your project has to stay current, it has to stay dynamic, and it has to change with the market, if it's a long-term project. And, without having to bulldoze it all along the way. Architecture, you can have sustainable architecture. Right now, energy and greenhouse gas emissions is something that's, very important in the market. I don't want to overplay that. LEED generated buildings or LEED certified buildings are thought to be, the market doesn't particularly care on a list of things that it looks for, and it's not the highest. It may be, as a developer, you'd like to have that, you want to be a good citizen, but LEED certified projects, again, you have to look for your own particular project, what you need in order to sustain that project through the life of your ownership of that project, and through the life of the project, and make it dynamic so it can change, with the time. So if you're putting in a road where that road's going to be overused by the time you put up buildings, how do you expand that road, or how do you put in rapid transit into that corridor? We'll plan for it in the beginning. You may not need it, but at least you have the expansion capability that makes it sustainable, rather than having to go dig up and tear up a development, put it in and go buy the rights to to put something in. That's the most difficult thing you can do.
Well, thank you very much, John, for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you.
If some of you guys want to stay around and ask him a few questions, then certainly feel welcome to do so. And we'll, if you need to, go ahead and break into your groups and kind of finish up whatever you need to. I'm going to give you a couple of updates. I actually just got an email from the developer down in Miami, so I'm going to share that information with you here in just a second.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're not talking about the Antigua project, right?
No.
Stanford.
Oh, we don't got you.
No, they don't need.
Oh,
Yes.
I looked at the project. When we did the Antigua, you bought it from,
Here you go. Well, that's a long story. Don't you look at
it runs
it?
Vail.
Yes. But it was reversed to sell. But,
I knew the history of it, and the two
Yes.
partners that were fighting in the
yes,
infrastructure.
we're with Apollo.
Huh?
We partner with one of the Apollo guys.
Okay. Okay.